Hello, everybody. Is this wonderful? Okay, it is 12 o'clock, so please do grab last bits and pieces of food and come on forward. There are still some seats right at the front. Please don't be afraid to come and take a seat at the front. Okay, right. Welcome, everybody, to the first event that we have here in the Sen Hub. We're kicking off with an absolute banger. So we have got wind and solar, energy saviours or blight on our communities. So if this is not what you're expecting, you're in the wrong room. My name is Lynsey Jones. I'm a Senior Climate Programme Manager here at the Conservative Environment Network. If you don't already know who we are the independent forum for Conservatives in the UK and abroad who support net zero, nature restoration and resource security. You will hear that plenty of times if you come to other events. So there you go. We have got some incredible speakers with us here today, so I will start with Rowley, Minister at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. We've got Vicky Ford, MP for Chelmsford, and a founding member of the Conservative Environment Network as well. We've got Tom Bradshaw, Deputy President of the National Farmers Union, and Cathal, Hennessy, I think I've pronounced it right, Head of Onshore Renewable Development at RWE. Special thank you to RWE for sponsoring this panel. Thank you very much. So we're going to start with some opening remarks first, just a few minutes before we crack off with Q&A. So please do start thinking about your questions already. We are going to start with 3 minutes of opening remarks so we can have as many questions as possible from our lovely audience. We are going to kick off with Lee. So if I can hand over to you first for some opening thoughts.
Sure. Does it work? Yeah. Hello, everybody. Hi, I'm Lee Rowley. I'm the Member of Parliament for North East Derbyshire and the Minister for Local Government, Building Safety and Large Infrastructure within the Department for Housing, Levelling Up and Communities. There's lots to talk about on this subject, and quite a number of these areas is more broad than my particular department, particularly the vexed question of onshore versus offshore development. And I know there will be strong views in the audience about that today, and we can get into that in the coming minutes of the discussion. What I just wanted to talk about as a starter, so that it doesn't get lost in the broader conversation, is just to talk to you about what the government is doing. We recognise there is, whether it's onshore or offshore, a significant demand for additional projects that are coming in the coming years. We recognise that there is a need to be able to create a system which, whatever people think about the individual applications, whether people think they're sited in the right place or the wrong place, whatever balance you may or may not decide you want onshore, offshore, or whatever type of energy it is, that we have a process that works as effectively as it can to get a decision. And for the last decade or so, we've had a nationally significant infrastructure project process, which is trying to create a process which is responsive and quick and efficient to get a decision for these larger projects, not just in energy, also in transport and elsewhere, but it's trying to make sure that that process works. And the reality is it's not working as well as it used to. You used to be able to get a decision within about 2.5 years. You're now up to over 4 years in that decision-making process. And so what the government's done, and it's working across a number of departments. Government's ability to work across departments is sometimes tested, but we've managed to do it so far. And we're working across 4 or 5 different departments to put together an action plan which tries to get the process of NSIP back down to what it was in terms of timelines, in terms of effectiveness, in terms of efficiency, back down to where it was about a decade ago, to get back to that 2.5-year rough approval rate for large projects and decision making in planning. If we can do that, whatever the application, whatever the demand, whatever we need to do for a country, and we've got some very big things that we've got to do on energy in the coming decade ahead. We've got some big things we need to do on transport, we've got some big things we need to do elsewhere. If we can get the process working again, it will hopefully allow us to get those decisions out, whatever those decisions are. And that's my job, working with my colleagues across the government, is to try and drive down the amount of time it takes to get a decision through better consultation, clearer guidance, clearer policy statements in the first instance. Happy to talk about that and more broadly the other policies in a moment, but hopefully that's useful as a start for 10.
That is wonderful, yeah. Right, okay, next we are going to head over to Vicky for some comments.
Are you really?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. You forgot to mention, Lynsey, that you are the most amazingly a talented person yourself. I've just returned from a trip to Norway with the Conservative Environment Network, and Lynsey is an absolute expert on all issues to do with energy transmission and how you try and think forward ahead. She also forgot to mention that the Parliamentary caucus for the Conservative Environment Network is the largest caucus of Conservative MPs. So any time you hear about what new Conservatives or ERG or whatever, the Sen caucus is actually the biggest, okay? And that's because deep in our hearts, I think one of the things that turns most of us into politics is the want to make the world a better place, not just for those who live in it now, but those who live in it in the future. And therefore, caring for the environment is a key part of what drives us when we think about our work. You wanted me to talk a bit about what my constituents say to me about these issues. So we did a bit of searching. In the past year, I've had 7 emails about onshore wind, all positive. I've had 9 about solar panels, of which the vast majority are positive, mostly wanting to make sure there's a solar panel on every new home. And I've had 8 people in my constituents not wanting the new pylons. Now, I think if I lived where you live, where it goes straight through your constituency, you may have more emails, but the new pylons would go about a couple of miles down my constituency boundary. Very few complaints about it. That compares to around 8,000 emails I get a year from constituents on different issues. I get a lot on please don't frack, please do care about the environment. But I just wanted to give you that feeling that people in Chelmsford, it is largely urban, they would like to see more movement towards renewables. They understand that that's going to mean infrastructure needs to come in place to get the electricity from one place to another. So I was very pleased to have been one of the MPs who backed the campaign to say we should have more onshore wind. It is one of the cheapest forms of electricity we can get, along with solar. And crucially, to have it where you want where local communities want it. And very interestingly, in this trip to Norway, one of the things we were looking at was how do they work with local communities. So we went to go and see a very large hydroelectric power plant up there, one the largest in Norway. And there, local communities get a financial benefit significant for having that type of infrastructure in their own backyard. And it brings communities on board. And I think there's a lot we could be learning about how does not just the landowner, for example, of a wind turbine benefit. The policies we used to have 10, 12 years ago, did not give a huge benefit to local people. There's been a sort of village hall fund, but not really a significant financial benefit in the way that we saw it in Norway. Sometimes I get people writing to me about why are we using fields for solar plants. And so I asked for some numbers on this because I'm a boring mathematician. And I happen to know someone who looks at this. So he explained to me that especially when you look at the trade-off between growing wheat for fuel versus using that land for solar, about 8% of the wheat that we grow in this country is going into biofuels at the moment. So if you use 1 acre of land for bioethanol, so growing wheat to turn it into fuel, that will produce enough energy to power around 13,000 miles per annum of car travel. That's before you look at the energy used in converting that wheat into the fuel. That same acre of land with solar panels in the right situation would deliver around 810,000 miles of driving your car. So multiple more benefits from making that straight to electricity to power an electric car. So when you look at that maths, I can understand why the government is saying, solar, onshore solar does need to be a significant part of delivering our future. I also happen to sit on the new Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee. It's a select committee of 11 members of Parliament. 4 of them are called Mark, 10 of them are men, and I'm the token girl. But very much enjoying being on that committee. Was founded just before the summer when the government decided to make that a specific business department. So one of the first things we did was call in a massive speed dating session, as I say that. I think we had over 60 different representatives from different parts of the industry and consumer groups and other groups who were interested in energy transformation and in doing our energy at the moment. And we've launched 4 different select committee reports. The first one we've done very quickly, taking evidence, and that's about preparations for this winter. How do we learn from last winter and make sure that vulnerable people don't get caught in that energy poverty trap? The government put massive amount of financial support into households, but there were still some groups of very vulnerable people. So that report came out last week, and then we've got three more that we're working on, one on home heating, one on the flexible grid issue, and one on the long-term technology mix of keeping our power on. So we are absolutely working flat out on some of these big questions to help come up, scrutinise the government, but also have good ideas. Thank you.
Wonderful. Vicky is far too kind there. But she is right that SEN is a very big caucus of MPs and peers. So, if you want any more information, we've got some little info packs just over there and lots of the SEN team around the room. But anyway, I'm a tangent there. Next up is Tom Bradshaw.
Good afternoon, everybody, and it's great to have an invite to talk to you today. I've just double-checked Vicky's maths in my head, and I think that the mathematician's just about right about the miles from bioethanol. So it's, but there's also a byproduct that comes out of bioethanol that goes into animal feed, which is also very important. And I think we all recognise that this is a transition. And the thing about bioethanol is that it's a lower carbon cost than fossil fuels are. So as part of a transition fuel, it's very important. And actually, there's a real challenge around bioethanol at the moment, and if we don't get it sorted, then by the 1st of January, we might not be able to produce any bioethanol. So many of you won't know about that, but that's a slight aside. Anyway, the NFU has a net zero ambition by 2040, and renewable energy for us is a crucial part of that. So we are very supportive of the need for renewable energy generation. As I got the train up here, looking out the window, and I wasn't looking out the window all the time, but I would suggest there's probably only 5 to 10% of houses that currently have solar panels on their roofs. There's a lot of new build industrial buildings that don't have solar panels on their roofs. There was an announcement probably 3 weeks ago now about a fund to support the fitting of solar panels to farm buildings coming out of government, and that's something that we very much welcome. Because at the moment, it's a higher unit cost putting them on roofs than it is putting them on the ground. And yet we've got all this roof space which isn't being utilised. So we have to work out how we can maximise the utilisation of that roof space. Now, one of the biggest barriers is the accessibility to the grid. So we've got 50 kilowatts of solar at home. We couldn't actually get any license to export any more at the moment. We've got one shed that could have another 30 kilowatts on. We can't get permission to export that. So how the grid infrastructure is developed to enable small businesses to access that grid is absolutely essential. Because what we find is that there are occasional very large-scale grid accessibility where generally power plants used to be and are no longer using those grid sites. But then you end up with a mass conglomeration of solar panels going in that one area and not being spread and not being put on roofs. So I think there is a balance here. We would say that the best and most versatile land has to be kept for food production. And we also are very mindful of the impact on tenant farmers. So if you're the landowner that's deciding that that land should go into a solar farm, but you've got a tenant, because it's a change of use, you're often able to break your tenancy, and how that tenant farmer is looked after is essential in part of that partnership that we, as things move forwards. We also think there should be permitted development rights for small or medium scale wind for single turbines that could be matched with solar panels and battery storage and really take businesses off grid. But not only that, they could also provide for local communities. So I think there's a real opportunity here to look at what a small scale farm or rural infrastructure grid could look like that can actually provide back into that rural community. And so I think that's something that we need to develop as we go forwards. We've got to look at the grid, as I say, in a strategic manner. At the moment, it's been piecemeal for probably the last 50 years, and the grid capacity is a huge problem. Vicky mentioned about the pylons. I put my hand up, they go through my farm. but they go through an area where we looked at getting outline permission for a wind turbine about 12 years ago, and there was absolutely no way we could achieve it. And now we'll have 50-metre pylons going through there if it goes ahead as planned today. So the strategic approach to the development of the grid is absolutely essential. We genuinely think we need to look at the offshore ring main. I think we wrote to the Minister about 3 or 4 years ago looking at that offshore grid. Because if you're in Norfolk at the moment, there's a crisscross of many power lines coming on, and actually the impact on that land in those areas is absolutely huge. I think when we look at wider scale national infrastructure, and really, Lee, this is one for you, we've got to make sure that the landowner, that the tenant farmer is really part of that discussion. At the moment, with some of our national infrastructure projects, farmers are being treated with absolute contempt. And it's disgusting, to be honest with you, the way that it feels like farmers are being treated in some of these situations. It's outside government, but government has a role in making sure that doesn't happen as we move forwards, because we all know that we need to improve our national infrastructure, and what we don't want is a rural-urban divide about this, and so we've got to try and make it work for everybody rather than just the few. And I think at the moment that is something that is really impactful and having a real problem.
Right, some really interesting challenges there, and also interesting proposal there from about small-scale grid there. Finally, got some comments from Cathal.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you to the Conservative Environment and Network for facilitating this conversation today. So a little bit about myself. So I'm responsible for onshore wind and solar PV development for RWE across the UK, so pretty much on the ground, and we see a variety of opinions obviously across the UK. And RWE, we are the largest generator of electricity in the United Kingdom across a variety of technologies: onshore wind, offshore wind, biomass, gas, and next year hopefully we will be generating from solar PV within the UK as well. So if there's previous speakers have actually mentioned a few points I was going to discuss. So to boil my points down to maybe 3 key takeaways. So if everyone leaves this room today just remembering these 3 key takeaways from onshore wind and PV is, number 1, onshore wind and solar PV is already delivering here in the United Kingdom. There's currently 14 gigawatts of onshore wind in operation, 15 gigawatts of solar PV, and it is the lowest cost of new generation. So we understand the cost of living crisis and how competitiveness of business is very important here in the United Kingdom, and driving down electricity prices is key to that. So more onshore wind, more solar PV will drive down electricity prices. Number 2, which has been mentioned by previous speakers, there's onshore wind and solar PV being located in and around communities provide benefits to local communities. And in RWE last year, we provided £4.3 million to local benefit schemes from our projects. But also there's benefits through the development, construction, operation of those projects. They're real tangible benefits. And I think the industry can do more on that regard as well. Last but not least, onshore wind and solar PV are popular. Government-owned think tank surveys this year said the majority of people, not just within society, but majority of people living close to and near operational projects are supportive of those projects. However, as mentioned again by previous speakers, it's not easy, right? Grid is a significant challenge. How can we get more of these cheap, low-cost renewables on the system to drive down electricity prices? Grid is a barrier. Also, the planning system, it's taking too long, right? It's taking too long to bring projects 4, 5, 8 years in some circumstances to get projects through the consenting regime across the UK. Can we reduce that? And I welcome the government's announcements recently to try and speed up the NSIP process. I think that's marvellous, and get more of the cheap renewable electricity on the system. However, it's taken too long, and the grid is costing too much and taking too long. So I think this discussion is going to be very interesting, and and hopefully there's a variety of opinions in the room we can discuss.
Yeah, that was wonderfully succinct. Love that. So before I take some questions from the audience, I'm going to use Chair's prerogative with a couple of my own to the speakers. So in this period, please do think of your own questions. We've got a few roving mics, which will come around in just a second. So I'm going to throw a few questions over to the speakers, and then it's over to you guys, so get thinking. So the first one I wanted to ask, which I'm sure we'll get some more from the audience, is to your point, Tom, on farming. So is the kind of narrative that we've often heard in the media around food security versus energy security, is that a real issue? Does solar really represent a challenge for food security?
I think farmers are very well placed to produce food, fuel, and fibre, and it's about getting that balance right. But it's also, it's not necessarily one. It's what we're seeing with food production. If you're not very careful, we've got 70 million people living on an island, and I would say there's no strategy as to how we're going to feed those 70 million people moving forwards. And at the moment, you've seen all the inflationary pressures. We've seen climate change taking hold across southern Europe. We need to take responsibility and put a plan in place as to how we're going to produce the food that's required. Now, imports will always be part of that, but strategically, I can't think of anything more vulnerable than not producing enough of our own food here. Once we've worked out how much of our own food we should produce here and how we're going to do that, then we look at the land that's available for energy and for fibre production. But food production should not be the poor relation. And that it feels at the moment, particularly with all the legislated environmental targets and no legislated targets for food production, the only loser out of that potentially is food production. And that's the bit where the balance, in our opinion, is wrong at the moment. And so it's not about no to energy, but it is about saying, how do we make sure that we really have a plan in place to feed everybody that needs to eat?
And Lee, when we're looking at kind of the planning guidance that government has around best and most versatile land, or some of the other kind of planning regs that we've heard already, has government got it right yet? I know you're doing some work on the NSIP process. How might that impact some of these questions that we're kind of themes that we're already starting to hear?
Well, it's always a balance. That's half the problem. That's why, or half the challenge. That's why lots of councillors spend a lot of their time trying to work through planning applications. It's the balance is a difficult one to strike. The point of the NSIP process is to recognise there are certain parts of the process, there are certain aspects of what we're trying to do which are so significant nationally that you need to have a process which gets those applications through, which we're trying to speed up. Exactly where the right balance is in terms of both the frameworks which we work on, things like the National Planning Policy Framework or the national policy statements which are going to be which underpin the NSIP process, which we're in the process of refreshing, is a very difficult one. That's why we go out to consult on them. But I don't think we're going to have it. There's no panacea answer to this. This is about making sure that you try to anchor your individual applications and as greater community consent as you can, whatever the output, whether it's positive or a negative one in terms of decision, and then also regularly review the overall frameworks within which they operate.
Okay. Cathal, would you agree on the planning guidance? More needs to be done to find that balance?
I think regarding food security and the balance with energy production, I think they can work in harmony. I think they already are working in harmony in a lot of circumstances. But I think the planning guidance can be a little bit stronger, I think, in this regard. But one of the things that it's not kind of A versus B, or take a choice. The challenges we have to deliver net zero and energy security targets are immense, right? And we need all technologies, right? So we need all offshore, onshore, solar PV, etc. So it's finding that balance and making sure that all the technologies are treated equally in the deployment as well.
Okay. And Vicky, last thoughts before I go over to Q&A?
Oh, yeah, I'm just interested. Who here is a party member? And who here is a local councillor? And who's ever been a local councillor as well? Okay, so there's quite a few local councillors here. So the familiarity with the planning issues will be something that you will know and understand why it's sometimes frustrating it takes so long. And because the planning process can take so long, that is hitting our ability to create greater energy security, that hits our ability to try and bring on stream more low-cost energy. And when we had our round table that I described to you with the 60 different players, again and again we were hearing this need to try and speed up the planning process. The work that Lee is doing is absolutely vital, and thank you, Lee, for doing that. And the Prime Minister's speech, again, absolutely vital that he's very focused on how do we speed up getting the right projects through planning, connected to the grid and delivered, because that will help people to bring down their electricity prices in a more sustainable and secure way for the future. If I may, Lynsey, another big bugbear of mine is not just getting the wind and solar there, but making sure that people can use that electricity in a way to meet their needs, and particularly heating their homes. So the UK is so far behind in the rollout of heat pumps. You know, in Finland, what was the number? They have one heat pump. There's 69 heat pumps for every 1,000 people. In Norway, it's 60. In France, it's 20. It's Ireland, it's 10. In the UK, it's 1.1. Okay, we are behind Hungary in the rollout of heat pumps. And not all homes will be able to have a heat pump, but there's loads of my constituents who could, and if they could get the investment, it would bring them cheaper ways to heat their homes. So what the government announced in the Prime Minister's speech about increasing the financial grants for heat pumps, absolutely key. But if I had a policy ask, I'd also like to look at the energy performance certificate and how that calculates the use of heat pumps, because I think that is... There's an anomaly there that needs to be corrected. If you put a heat pump in, you are making your home more energy efficient, not less.
Wonderful, right. I've got Sam on roving microphone. I've already got loads of hands up. Oh my goodness, it's brilliant. I'm going to take groups of 3, and I'm going to try and direct them to the various speakers we've got. If you could please say your name, if you're representing an organisation, and I beg of you, please, no comments. Please try and keep it to a question so we can get through as many of these raised hands as possible. Right, I'm going to try and start this side and then come to this side. So we'll go front row first. There's 1, 2, and then 3. 1 in the middle, then after that, Sam, and then after that. Okay, right. First one.
Hi, my name is David Cowdery. I am working for the MCS Charitable Foundation. I'm picking up on Tom's comments and leads. Small-scale wind is absolutely vital, especially for the farming community and permitted development for community energy. But we have an issue where it's only 11.1 metres in height at the moment. It should be 30 metres because mobile masts have been increased to 30 metres, and it will make a huge difference because farmers are on commercial rates for electricity, and by actually allowing them to generate when the sun isn't shining, the wind is blowing, it provides that balance, and it doesn't take away commercial farmland, and so it's really good for farmers. So the question for me is, will you actually increase the height of small-scale wind to 30 metres?
Lovely. Okay, the next question.
Yeah, and I'd like to, my name's Tony Caldera, I'm the president of the City of Liverpool Conservatives, and I'm also a business owner, and recently we installed 0.5 megawatt of solar PV on our roof, significant development. It was sadly restricted by the grid to only allow us 300 kilowatts of export. The roof has the capacity to generate 1 megawatt, but of course the restriction now actually means that the viability of generating that 0.5 megawatt of electricity, which is a significant amount, has been stopped because we don't have the grid capacity. One very quick point before I ask the question is I'd like to praise the NFU because when we went out to look for prices for solar export, the NFU actually came up as giving the best prices. Your agent there, congratulations. But the question effectively is, what do the panel members think we should do to accelerate the improvement of the grid to allow projects like mine to take place so that we can get to net zero quicker and feel the benefit of projects like mine?
Wonderful, love it. And the final, third question.
Thanks. Thanks for the great panel discussion, particularly like the comments on heat pumps. Really agree with Vicky on that. So as I'm sure we're probably all aware, the last contracts for difference round failed to secure any offshore wind contracts. I was keen to hear panellists' reflections on this and how they think we can make sure the next auction round is a success. Thanks.
Wonderful. Okay, so First up, I am going to come to Lee because there was a direct question around guidance on height and maybe a broader one if any of the other panellists are interested on efficiencies. How can we improve efficiencies in some of these processes beyond just increasing height restrictions? Lee?
Well, I mean, this is slightly outside my portfolio. It's in the Housing Minister's portfolio, Rachel McLean, but the government made an announcement on the 5th of September, I think it was, which increased the opportunity around onshore wind. Now, some of you will have views about that either way, but it is an indication that the government has listened to some of the requests, both from colleagues and the broader discussion about the need to look at onshore wind. That's as far as we think it is reasonable to go at the moment, and that's the updated National Planning Policy Framework. We're always very happy to sound like a politician, don't we? But we're always very happy to talk more about this in the future. But there is a balance to be struck here, and we know both as a party and as a country that there is people with different views about this. But the move forward on the 5th of September, I hope, is an indication that the government is listening on this area.
Okay. Tom, do you think some of the kind of efficiency improvements would help get some of these projects to be more acceptable to farmers?
Yeah, I mean, we support the move to 30 metres. It was something that we spoke about when I spoke at an event in Parliament. And so I think that that's something that should definitely be looked at. For me, the thing we can do today that improves grid capacity is actually make battery storage as cheap as possible, because that gives you a huge buffer. To actually invest in the grid is a decade plus of work that's really going to make any difference. Whereas if we look at utilising battery storage, then that's how we can create that buffer initially, which means your solar you're producing at midday can be sold at peak at 6 p.m. and actually gives some real solutions. So while it's not the perfect long-term solution, that's where the short-term I think sits, is with solar, wind and battery storage coupled together that then can be exported at those peak times.
Wonderful. Vicky, I wonder if you have any thoughts on the grid capacity or perhaps on the CFD round that recently happened.
So on the grid capacity and on your 30 metres turbine, do make sure that you send the select committee when we do the call for evidence, because there's a lot of us on the committee who are really interested in small local grids, especially in rural areas. On the grid connection, so I was really pleased with what the Prime Minister had put in his speech. 14 years it can take to build new infrastructure, and that there's enough projects waiting to be connected to generate over half of the country's future electricity needs. So it is, a real need. So he's announced that we're going to set out a new spatial plan to look across the whole country. And bringing in reforms to energy infrastructure, speeding up the planning, stopping the sort of first come, first served approach, but making sure that projects that are ready to be connected can get connected first. So those were his big picture announcements from that speech. And I don't think enough was made that is really transformational. Okay, it is important that we get that through. On the offshore wind, I mean, this is an area where we are the world leader, okay? Norway, loads of water in Norway. They are fascinated to learn from us and really wanted to learn from us last week on how they can build more offshore, both fixed and floating wind. So it was really not good that auction went that way. Now, I can understand what had happened, because of the war in Ukraine, rise in energy prices, more countries have suddenly started investing in offshore wind. There's been more demand for the turbines and other technologies, so that's pushed up the prices. So when the price had been set, as I understand it, that hadn't taken into account enough of the change in dynamics of what's been going on in the market. Absolutely key that we get that right. The other thing that Lynsey and I were talking about is how you could make that contract also look at local jobs and local benefits. So we may be the leader in installing and generating offshore wind. I'd be interested in the power companies here, but we don't own the supply chain. We're not manufacturing these. There's lots of jobs in the installation, but not in the manufacturing. And maybe we should be looking at awarding some of those contracts. What do they bring in terms of other local jobs and benefits, etc.? And especially then when you move into other new technologies like tidal flow, which we could lead the world in, would we also have the manufacturing capacity here too? That would be great.
Wonderful. And finally, Cathal, what do you think about the CFD round? What needs to be done next time to make sure we get lots of offshore, but also ramping up onshore as well?
Yeah. For RWE, the AR5 recent auction was mixed news. So in one hand, we were very successful. We had 6 solar projects, 2 with batteries actually, hybrid as well, and 3 onshore wind projects. So we're obviously quite happy, and that will obviously speed up the deployment of onshore and solar PV. But it was a missed opportunity for offshore wind, and we have been very vocal, and I think the industry has been very vocal on the shortcomings of the auction structure, and this was well flagged and forecasted, I think, in advance of the auction. So from our perspective, going forward to AR6, we would believe that a separate pot for offshore wind and to have onshore and PV in a separate pot to speed up, again, it's about speed, deployment of these technologies. That's all technologies to meet our net zero and energy security targets. And I think that's what's needed. And even on the other points that were talked about, the self-generation, RWE's perspective, again, it's like all shoulders to the wheel to deliver this. Any technology, anywhere is needed. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, some more questions. We're going to go this side next. Okay, got one. Sorry, if you can come over. Gentleman in the aisle, gentleman second row, and then the last hand that's still up back there. Yeah. Please remember to say your name if you've got an organisation that you're representing, and a question.
Good afternoon. Tony Gould, Town Councillor, and I happen to be on the Planning Committee. I make the observation that although the town has declared a climate emergency, it seemed to have done nothing other than buy a dozen electric vehicles, all liveried, so I think it's a greenwashing project. However, they fail to put any condition on new building to put solar panels on the roof. And I think this is a lost cause which could be driven from central government. If we're putting up either farm buildings for Tom or industrial buildings as they are in the local area, or even houses, they all higgledy-piggledy for fashion, but they don't have any south-facing roofs, so there's a lost opportunity there. I recall that in many days this year, we've had sun and wind, and our national grid gets something like 50% of its total power from those sources. On a day like today, it's probably close to 0. So we do need a nuclear base load, and there's been no mention of that so far. My view, however, though, is that the solar panels and the wind, that energy needs to be either stored or used. Stored is a bit problematical insofar that many electric vehicles catch fire, so insurance is being withdrawn from them. The biggest solar battery in the world in Australia is currently on fire, and they're just waiting for it to burn out. Surely the solution will be what is called green energy, whereby when you get solar power, you have to use it. Why don't you use electrolysis, create hydrogen, and then instead of having electric vehicles, have hydrogen-powered vehicles, which will solve your problem.
That's slightly off topic there. Right, okay. There's lots in that to pick out. I won't go into hydrogen versus EV cars. That's for another day, another panel. Second question here.
Yeah, so interesting to hear from the panel some of the issues you've talked about today. Unfortunate, I heard most of these called out on a stage 6 years ago by Robert Llewellyn and members of the National Grid at Fully Charged. So these aren't national, these are not new problems. My question is, the things you've described today sound like linear tinkering with the system for problems that have been around for a while. And this is an exponential shift in the world's energy generation usage, storage, and how we use that commercially. Is this process fit for purpose, or do we need something more radical? I get what you're doing, Lee, that sounds great if you can shift. If I went to my PLC board and proposed that I could get my major strategic decision-making down to 2.5 years, I wouldn't be there very long. So is it enough?
is tinkering enough, or do we need something really different?
Lovely. And the third question...
Sorry, can I just say one other thing? I'm on my third electric car in 6 years and none have caught fire yet, but thanks for the heads up.
Certainly. My name is Billy James. I'm a long-term environmentalist and member of the London Cycling Campaign, but my career has all been in the private sector, in the international private sector, and I'm well aware that the UK's contribution to global warming is minimal, and that with Mr. Putin now, one of our primary requirements is food security. So before we talk about wind and, for example, solar, which is doing a great deal of damage by using up valuable agricultural land, which we're now going to need for wheat, shouldn't we actually get the basics right of working out how renewable energy can be made reliable?
Wonderful. So we've got quite a lot to unpack there. The first one I'm going to go on is conditions for new builds, because this, I think, is a really interesting subject. Should we be future-proofing, despite the fact I hate that term, future-proofing all our houses and putting requirements on new builds to have better insulation, have a heat pump maybe, or have solar panels on roofs? So does anyone want to volunteer for this, or else I'm going to pick on someone?
I'll do. Yeah, sure.
Lee?
So, as Conservatives, we would ideally want the market to work here, right? So, because we get into this discussion very, very quickly, where it's what a government does and basically how government spends your money, how government subsidises things. So, as Conservatives, we would ideally like to get to the end point where actually all of these things work in alignment. And, there's been a massive reduction in the cost of solar panels. So, if some of these trajectories continue, you may get there where things wash their face without government intervention, without government prodding, without government demand, just to put the Conservative point in there. But in lieu of that, we have to make a set of decisions within our country about what we do or don't want to do and where we do or don't want to put government capacity and your money. And one of the things which we do that through is decisions about building efficiency and building standards. It's not really particularly talked about, but we have already significantly increased building standards and the efficiency of new builds. That has occurred in June last year. The Part L uplift, as it's technically known, all new houses right now have to be 30% more efficient than the ones built a couple of years ago. So there has already been a significant amount of progress on that. We're about to consult, as we've committed, on something called the Future Home Standard and Future Building Standard, which will come in 2025, which will make properties, subject to going through that consultation, listening to everybody and what they want to say, zero carbon ready, so that when the grid decarbonises, when you get rid of fossil fuels off the grid, basically they have very little carbon footprint. But that's going to take time to get through, and we've got to get through the process of of listening to people and making sure that people's considerations are taken into account. So there's a huge amount coming, but when people say we should put solar panels on every single property, we could do that. That's probably the biggest part of my ministerial postage bag. But there's going to be properties out there where solar panels are not the right answer because they're not in the right direction, because there's basic stuff like shade in the way or whatever. So the question we have to decide for ourselves is whether we're going for technology-specific answers or whether we're going for performance. And the government has been very clear it wants to go for performance. So it's going to say, hit this standard, you choose how to get there, but you hit this standard. And I think a lot of that standard will be delivered by solar panels in the future, but it doesn't have to be delivered by solar panels. So it could be very strong insulation, whatever. So it's about trying to work with industry whilst we still have these gaps in terms of cost and in terms of capacity, try and make things more efficient as we go, whilst the technology moves on as we expect it still to do in the way it has done already.
Interesting. Vicky, do you think we're doing enough? What with the scale of the challenge?
So I absolutely agree that we've got to do everything we can, okay? Not only from the net zero point of view, but from the security point of view and from the point of view of having affordable energy too. They all come together. And so you need that mix, as the RW have warned us, of lots of different technologies. And yes, we've been saying that for many years, as the second gentleman said. Actually, wind and solar are proven technologies. They are the cheapest forms of electricity, especially onshore wind. Offshore wind prices have come down dramatically. We're the world leader. Let's use those resources. But we need to do other things as well. As the gentleman said, there's times when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. There's a wonderful word. It's called Dunkelflaute. Right? It's a German word. I love it. When that time, Dunkelflaute. And that's why I'm really pleased that the government's announced about Sizewell C, getting the next generation nuclear. We need the small nuclear. The project that Lynsey and I went to see in Norway about carbon capture and storage, actually to see it happening in real world, not just on a PowerPoint presentation, absolutely key. The UK can be a world leader in carbon capture and storage from our geography as well. We need all these things to work. Do I think we need more of a sort of seismic change, as you were saying? No, I think we just need to do what we said we were going to, what we were going to do in a clear way. Unlocking the electricity, the grids, the connections to the grid, the planning work that Lee is doing is absolutely key part of that. Making homes more energy efficiency, unlocking the heat pumps for those that at work. All of these things can go together. And in terms of electric vehicles catching on fire, again, last week we were in Norway, 100% now of practically of Norwegians drive electric vehicles. They do that because they work, because very rural areas, much more rural than some of us, they've got the charging. They had big cash incentives to do it, but once you've gone into electric vehicles, they work, they can be reliable, and they can give you very cheap transport once you've made the initial investment. That's why people will buy them.
I mean, the cost of charging at the moment and on national infrastructure is astonishingly high for electric vehicles, and that is one of the big barriers that we've got, is our electricity costs. And so we're talking here about how we produce more electric. It's all well and good producing more electric, provided it does then drive down the cost, the unit cost of electric. Yeah. If we don't end up doing that, then electric vehicles may always sort of end up still being expensive to run. If you charge them at home overnight and things like that, it's very different. On your point about food production, look, I think I've been very clear that we've got to have a plan for feeding 70 million people living on this island, and that simply can't be offshoring it to other parts of the world. We've been very good at offshoring our carbon emissions to other parts of the world already, and so we can't do that with food production, but we also have to be very mindful that when we're importing anything, whether that be energy, whether it be food, or whether it be whatever Amazon's delivered to your houses this morning, there's a carbon footprint associated with that, but very rarely is that calculated here in the UK. And so we can be quite smug at times that we're doing a lot for carbon, but actually others are still producing that carbon. So I think that's something that we just need to be very mindful that we don't, we can offshore food production, but the risk that brings with it is absolutely huge. And particularly when you look at the geopolitical situation we're living in today, which is very uncomfortable. It's tragic events over in the Ukraine, but it's not just the Ukraine. And we've just got to be mindful of where this all sits for the future. So having that food production plan is something that I hope in the run-up to the next election we'll see it being a very big issue as to how we're going to be producing the food this country needs for the future.
Tom, I'm also interested in what you think about solar panels on farm buildings.
I don't think today we could make it compulsory, because actually if you haven't got a way of exporting that to the grid, then the cost is just too prohibitive. So I wouldn't support it being compulsory until we know we've got an ability to export it to the grid.
Very interesting. Okay, and finally, Cathal, I wonder, so we've heard about is the solutions that we're all talking about here, is that big enough for the challenge? I also wanted to ask you, this is slightly different to the question we had, but we've heard about kind of food security versus energy security. I was wondering what RWE are doing around nature restoration with some of your projects as well. Appreciate that's another question perhaps for farming as well. But just wondering, firstly, are we doing enough to really tackle this challenge? And secondly, how does that play into some of your developments you've got onshore?
Yeah, well, in our onshore developments, we give a lot of our attention to how do we increase the biodiversity net gain of all our projects. That's for onshore wind and solar PV. So we try and have at least 30% increase in biodiversity net gain on our solar PV projects, which also combined, we try and combine that with recreational facilities as well for local communities as well. So I think this is just one of the areas that onshore renewables can contribute to the climate crisis. It's not just energy security crisis. There's also a biodiversity crisis ongoing as well, so it's quite important. And but it's these incremental but continuous improvements that we need with landowners and working collaboratively with farmers and local communities. I think the energy sector, and particularly onshore wind and solar PV, can contribute quite significantly in this regard.
Great. We have time for one final quick round. Okay, so quick. We've got 10 minutes left. Oh yeah. If there are any, okay, wonderful. Finn, there's two next, kind of nearby each other, gentleman in the aisle and the lady in blue, maybe. Yeah. And then there's another person in the aisle here. We'll take as many as we can. And try to get through a couple. So. First one in the aisle.
Thank you. Richard Clure, Leader, Wiltshire Council. Firstly, 51.7% of our energy comes from renewables at this moment. It was 52% when the gentleman spoke, so it's a lot. Coming to a question. Wiltshire Council, we have the second highest solar generation in the UK. We've got Europe's largest battery farm. But we're starting to hit some real problems with the cumulative impact of solar farms in the same area. And planning isn't giving us anything to ameliorate that. I'm broadly supportive of the solar farms, but when you get a village like Sandridge, which, if the latest application comes through, will essentially be completely surrounded by solar farms in an area that's the size of a small town and totally changes the rural nature, that should have been a national infrastructure project, but it's being done in different chunks. How do we resolve that? How do we stop it being done quite so much to people and give residents a little more say in that acceleration in those areas where you've got grid capacity and the right conditions?
Fantastic. Love how quick it was as well.
Hello, I'm Fatima. I'm here as a party member, but as a day job, I project manage the development of wind farms in Wales. One of the biggest problems we have is not actually the wind farms. The communities like it. It's the pylons. They get really upset over the pylons, and unfortunately, a lot of these protests and the massive protests are spearheaded by Conservative councillors. So my question is, how am I, as a project manager, meant to convince a community that these pylons are fine when there are Conservative councillors who are holding big public meetings, spreading EMF propaganda, all sorts?
Okay, great. That is a difficult one. Don't envy you there. And then finally here.
My name is Joey Jones, and before I'm a contrarian, let me say that we are a carbon zero energy positive residential developer here in the UK right now, and your 30% over what a year ago is a tick box, but not enough to make a difference. It's possible to build beyond A+ EPC rating right now, but the big PLCs aren't going to do it, and that's who you're talking to. So my question is, are you talking to more of the contrarians, or are you talking to the people that support what you believe? The farmers in the U.S. absolutely hate the wind turbines, and they're all over the place, and we're years and years ahead of you in that. And we're also having a problem with what we do with them, because the 20-year lifespan, what do you do with this monstrous thing that you can't recycle? And we've got huge yards of them laying around. So don't just look at the things that support what you want to believe. Look at the whole picture. We're killing whales and dolphins and all kinds of marine life in the U.S. trying to do offshore wind. That's a problem.
Right, okay. So we have got loads there. Lee, I have a feeling a lot of these are coming your way. We've got pylons. We've got solar farms in the same area. And also community engagement. So I wonder perhaps, you've talked a bit about the NSIP process. By the sounds of it in Richard's area, what has been done to avoid the NSIP process is to break up some of these projects. How do you address that if some of these developers are playing smart?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, if you get multiple applications of 49.9 gigawatts of solar panel capacity, there is a rather large potential that you might be using a particular process because you think that's easier or quicker or more likely to get there. It's obviously something, it sits between myself and Rachel as the TCP, as the Town Country Planning Act Planning Minister. It's obviously something we're aware of. It is difficult. Wherever you set the threshold, there will always be people, any system, any approach, whatever, people work to thresholds, right? So, but it is something we're definitely cognizant of. I think on the pylons point, I'm going to state the obvious, but the reality is we've all got to decide what we want to be as a country. We've all got to decide what our objectives are as a country. There are going to be things which matter in individual parts of the UK, and I get that. If I was on panels 4 years ago vociferously opposed to fracking, because fracking had the potential to cause a massive issue within North East Derbyshire, and I would do so again if there was a problem. And I get that every area will have particular things that they feel very strongly about. But the thing that this party cannot become, this party cannot say no to everything. So if you have strong views about one thing, that's fine. Fine within the processes, fine within the, but don't say no to everything. That's where the Liberal Democrats get into the silly places like they got last week with house buildings, and that we've all got to take a self-denying ordinance on some of that, And then finally, just on the point about building to higher standards. Of course, we want to build to higher standards. I do think, to Vicky's point at the very beginning, we do have to look at EPCs and how we reform them. But in terms of the highest standards we can, I absolutely agree. But we've got to do, and I accept there will be a variety of organisations and companies who do those well or less well, the builders and the developers. But we've also got to be cognizant of what it does in terms of cost. And that is, that it is absolutely vital that we build houses in a way which minimise the impact on our environment, but it's also vital that when we build them, people are there who can buy them. And we've got to make sure that we don't load costs on to an extent that first-time buyers can't get on the housing ladder. So it's all about that reasonable, proportionate, careful approach to these things, whereby we're moving policy through over a period of time so that we're taking communities with us, we're taking people with us, and we're getting the ultimate objective at the end of the day.
Vicky, you look like you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, just on the issue of pylons, I'm just wondering if Sen can help here a bit. Maybe if we could do a bit of myth-busting research to help with some of the EMF propaganda, and maybe do some myth-busting. But also, Andrea Ledson floated an idea in the Commons recently of saying you should try and always put your pylons down main roads and along railway lines. I'm not sure if that works, but also in valleys, not down hilltops, we've discussed today. And maybe Sen could be trying to help think about some of these solutions, if that might be helpful for Lee and ministers in the future, if we were trying to come together with busting the myths, and B, some suggestions on how you might make that work. I feel very much for the local councillor who's got his whole area being covered with solar panels, and I think some of what we've been trying to say about it should be where local communities want them is important as well. And is the local community getting the benefit? Is the local community going to see a benefit from having the pylons go, or is the money just going to end up with the landowner getting some cash, but not necessarily the other people who are looking at it?
I mean, the landowner won't get enough. That's just the problem. So I was going to say, in that situation, it's often landowners that don't want it. And that's because the process isn't just and isn't fair. And so, we don't want to be against national infrastructure projects. That's not a position the NFU often takes. But if there is genuinely an alternative, then we always think that should be looked at. But normally the alternative will still go over our members' land. So it's one member versus another. When there's an offshore grid versus an onshore grid, then that is something that we need to see those proposals looked at in detail. So I think you've got to really look at how the farmers and landowners have been looked after during that process. The other one is when you're looking at whole communities being taken over with a lot of solar farms. Sorry, I didn't get your name. But I think what we all could have done there is say, well, what's the available grid capacity at that connection point? And then if you end up with smaller solar farms coming forward, it's inevitable that there's going to be others bolted on. And so that total grid capacity is what's going to dictate the likely demand for the projects in that area. And then I think you can take an overhead approach and say, well, are we happy that in this vicinity we're going to end up with 200 megawatts of solar or whatever it may be? But you could look at it differently.
I'm going to give final word to Cathal. We have almost run out of time. So if you've got any final reflections on the questions we've had or about what you've heard on this panel, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think just on one of the last questions there regarding cumulative impact and the lady who's developing in Wales, and I can feel some of the frustrations on both sides. One thing that we do, and I'm sure other developers do as well, is we spend a considerable amount of time in selecting our sites for development. So we sieve through significant amount of constraints, analysis, and look at cumulative impact. We don't want to have cumulative impact. So we try and sieve out those sites as much as possible. And as part of that process, we have a very robust community consultation process where we talk to elected members, community activists, people just living locally with the community, and we take those opinions on board. And I think that is key as part of the energy transition here, because this is what it is. It is a transition. It's not a switch. It's not going to happen overnight. And we have to listen to local opinions and incorporate those into our projects. But on the flip side, it's when we have those opinions and when we create our planning proposal, we need swift decisions. We need to know quickly if the project is going to be refused. We need to know quickly if the project is going to be approved. And that is key. And I think it's this lethargic and delaying tactics, and some intentional, some non-intentional, I think is the challenge for us to get to those net zero and energy security targets.
Brilliant. I honestly, I have so many more questions I could ask. I'm sure you guys do as well. But that is our time. So thank you very much for your wonderful questions. Thank you very much to our wonderful speakers, to Vicky, Tom, Lee, and to Cathal, and to RW for sponsoring. Before you go, please do stick around for tackling air pollution, which is our next panel. And we also have a fantastic campaign on wildflowers at our stand in the exhibition hall. So please do go check that out and ask our SEND team members some lovely questions. Hopefully see you in some more panels.